Already buzzing up the microphone. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Karen Maher. I'm the Director of Anti-Trafficking Initiatives at the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking, which we also refer to as INCASA HT. It's just easier than to say all the words. I always hate to make people move for a presentation, but I noticed everybody's split off to the sides. And so if you want to say regret, that's fine. But if you want to consider moving into the middle, thank you, sir. It's really appreciated. Just because my head's going to be so back and forth. So yeah, we're going to be talking about human trafficking this afternoon. How many of you have been to the human trafficking training previously? I got one over here, one over here, a couple over here, so beautiful people. Okay, so for you folks, you probably will still learn some new things today. For everybody else, you'll be kind of getting the foundation of what we're talking about. So if you are not familiar with NSHP, we are the statewide coalition for sexual assault response programs in Indiana. So we support rape crisis centers, sexual assault response teams. We do advocacy at the state house, not just for survivors, but also for those that work with them. So we advocates, systems personnel. We do a lot of outreach and training. And then on the trafficking side of things, we actually co-chair the Indiana Protection for Abuse and Trafficked Humans Task Force, known as IPAP. This is a statewide multidisciplinary team. We co-chair that alongside the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. And I'm actually the statewide task force coordinator, so it's my job to oversee the task force and keep everything moving in the right direction. So we do a lot of training, and you'll hear from my colleague Marissa on the training that she does for rape crisis centers, again, training for sexual assault response teams across the state, child advocacy center MDTs, and then we also have tailored trainings. We get a lot of different requests, whether it's, we got one from the Indiana Department of Transportation, we get them from hospitals, we get them from service providers. And so we always make an effort to tailor the trainings for the audiences that we are speaking to. And the slides are going to advance whether I'm advancing them or not. So I'll try and work with them. So this is what IPAP looks like. This is our state task force, and you can tell there's a lot going on there. Marissa and I call this the Ferris wheel because that's what it looks like. So we have the folks in the middle are the core leadership. So our office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, DCS, the Attorney General's Office, and then leadership from all of these other pieces. So we have substantive committees and working groups. So law enforcement, service providers, a whole bunch of different folks on the service provider committee. We have a labor trafficking specific committee. They are the folks who do our outreach and youth prevention education. So, and then you'll also see these other task forces and regional coalitions. They are in local areas around the state, and they are members of the statewide task force as well. So kind of the idea of this, even though there's a lot going on, is that we're all working on one unified statewide effort. So before I move on, I'm going to bring Marissa up for a second. We're not quite into her part yet, but I wanted her to explain to you all the housing subcommittee that I asked her to start on the victim services committee.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Marissa Hofstad, and my role at HT is anti-trafficking special projects coordinator. So I'm always on the lookout for what special project is next. And the victim services committee, they meet a couple times a year, like four to 6 times a year. And so in one of our committee meetings, we were talking about the biggest needs and barriers that clients face, and housing just kept rising to the top, as all of you are know well. So keeping in mind the specific needs for survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, there are a lot of barriers that the general public may not face in navigating housing. So I've been really blessed to engage with ICDA, that's been a privilege, and also building up trafficking professionals, anti-trafficking professionals, and engaging them in conversation about housing. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but so that is represented at the specific project on the state task force.
Marissa, as Marissa said, housing is such a great need for survivors of trafficking. It's probably the number one need that we encounter when people are calling us for assistance. Both Marissa and I have gotten phone calls from all over the state, whether it's law enforcement or service providers saying, hey, we have somebody that we're working with and we need housing. Do you have anything for us? And so it's been a process of trying to track down what the resources are. And so we were super excited that we connected with IHCA to figure out, what a coordinated entry is, and it's been a learning curve for us, for sure. There's a lot that we didn't know. But it's been a really great connection and a way for us to figure out, are there more resources that we're not currently having? So before we get started, I want to talk about how important your role is in terms of providing housing. So, it's something where, we know that vulnerable populations are the ones that are exploited in human trafficking. And so it may be a situation where maybe somebody's vulnerable because they don't have housing. They haven't been exploited yet. And if you are able to provide that resource to them, you are actually preventing them from being trafficked and being exploited. You have met that need that somebody has not been preying on. And also identification. So this is something we talk about a lot. It's something that's difficult to do because human trafficking victims, most of the time, do not self-identify. They don't know that they're a victim. They may think they're in love with somebody who's actually exploiting them. That's their boyfriend or their husband. There's a whole host of reasons they don't recognize that what's happening to them is a crime. So being additional eyes and ears for people that are coming through the shelters and being able to possibly be the first ones to identify them is huge. And then finally, somebody who has been identified as a human trafficking victim, but they need that resource of housing. If that's provided to them, you may be preventing further exploitation. So really, really important what involves people. So really quick, just so you know, this is something that we had to learn when we started researching HUD regulations, because we are not housing experts like you all, right? We did not know what the HUD regulations were. And so you can see category 4, human trafficking. Human trafficking is in the categories. This was added, I can't remember what year, but this is a little bit newer. It was added in a category with domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, because the recognition is they share a lot of the same pieces. And then for the emergency housing voucher program, again, you'll see eligible populations include those that are committing those particular crimes, including human trafficking. So, all that to say, because they're in the regulations, because housing providers are, tasked with meeting that need, obviously, to know what human trafficking is. So presentation objectives, we're actually going to define human trafficking under state and federal law. We're going to understand the overlap between homelessness and human trafficking. We'll learn the dynamics of why trafficking victims don't often self-identify, or even if they understand something's going on that's not okay, they won't reach out for help. They do not trust systems personnel. There's a whole host of reasons for that. And then understanding the importance of a survivor-centered response. Marissa, I think she mentioned briefly, or she might be talking about this, that she is on IHCA's task force to look at updating the PS data. And so hopefully I'm saying that correctly. We're still, again, learning this whole process, but part of that is looking at assessment tools to figure out, are they survivor-centered? Do they apply to someone who might be a human trafficking victim? Are we identifying them, and how are we responding to them? And then just understanding what the resources are. Really quick, I always, at the beginning of all of my trainings, I always do a little explanation of the terms victim and survivor, because in this field, you'll see them used interchangeably. And so I've had people ask me over the years, when do you use the term victim? When do you use the term survivor? Victim generally is used when we're talking about a legal definition, when we're talking about state statutes, somebody who has been, they have been victimized in a crime, or we're looking at, DCS's regulations and who is considered a child in need of services. That's generally when you're going to see that term. When we say survivor, really we consider this best practice in our field. You're recognizing the fact that somebody who's been through an exploitative situation and come through it is a survivor. That takes a lot of strength to be able to go through a circumstance that hard. And then, when we're talking about interacting with somebody who's been in a situation, they may not prefer either term. They may prefer something different. They may prefer not to be termed as anything at all. And that's something that, when Marissa talks about assessment tools and what that might look like down the road, being really respectful of how they want to be viewed and referred to. Right, so federal law, these are the federal definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So you can see recruitment, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting somebody for the purpose of commercial sex act, which was seduced by force, fraud, or coercion, or the individual was under 18 years old. So basically what that means, if a minor is involved in commercial sex, they are automatically considered a human trafficking victim under federal law. And that's actually the case under state law as well. And when we say commercial sex, this is really important to know because very often we tend to think, exchanging sex for money, right? And it can definitely be that, but it's anything of value. So if they're exchanging sex for a place to stay, and housing is such a big need, that's considered human trafficking under the federal law. If they're exchanging it for drugs, or clothes, for food, any of those things count for purposes of commercial sex. And really important to know for minors, that forced fraud or coercion does not need to be proven, only in adult cases. Labor trafficking is a little bit different. The forced fraud or coercion does have to be proven regardless of the person's age. But again, you have that force, fraud, coercion, and all of those things means. We also think it's really helpful to break it down. The AMP model was created by the Polaris Project. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And so it kind of shows you have to have one of these actions by one of these means for one of these purposes. And let me just say really quick, we're not expecting you all to figure out when you're coming across somebody and you're seeing the red flags. We don't expect you to investigate, right? Talk to witnesses and interview them and track down all these pieces. We just want you to have a better sense of what does it look like, might you be seeing it. So you have the action at the start, you have the means, and then for one of those purposes, and it's pretty self-explanatory. Apparently I have this done now. So forced fraud or coercion, it's helpful to kind of think about what does that actually look like. Force is pretty self-explanatory, right? That can be feeding somebody, raping them, gang rape, confinement, torture practices. I mean, it's terrible that we have to talk about that, but unfortunately that can be a thing in many cases. Fraud is really more false promises saying, especially for labor trafficking, you're gonna be doing this type of job for this much money. And then it's really completely different work and they're not getting paid at all. Blackmail, lying about the work conditions, and then coercion. We see in almost every case in some instances, so it very often overlaps with these other pieces. So it can be that threat of serious harm, saying, I'm gonna kill you, I'm gonna kill your family, I know where your family lives. If the person has children, you'll never see your child again unless you do what I'm asking you to do. Controlling their daily life skills, basically taking all of their choices away. They tell their person they're exploiting, what kind of work they're gonna do and the hours they're gonna work and when they can sleep and when they can eat, even very often what name they're about to use and saying you have to bill by this particular name on your actual name. So it's really difficult, and this will kind of help you conceptualize when we get to the piece about why don't they leave, why don't they reach out for help. They get to a point where they're so manipulated that it's difficult for them to see outside of that and the potential that they can actually do something different. Thank you. So maybe I used to back in the day when I started doing trainings because I'm a lawyer by background. I used to put in every statute and read them, and I don't think anybody appreciated that. So I stopped doing that, and I tried to break it down to some really important points that I think you all should know. So, individuals under the age of 18 cannot be arrested for prostitution. This law changed in about 2017. Prior to that, they could be arrested for prostitution, which was a pretty big loophole because we had minors who were clearly under all the other statutes of victim of human trafficking, but then being arrested for prostitution, which didn't make any sense. So thankfully, we changed that law. And the bottom line is there's no such thing as an underage prostitute. You'll see it sometimes and it drives me crazy if you're looking at news stories, you know, in the paper, or you're talking about something on TV and they'll say juvenile prostitute or child prostitute. There's no such thing. We're talking about a child who's being trafficked and exploited. So really important to keep that in mind. Again, just like the federal law, that force threat of force fraud does not need to be proven. If we're talking about a minor involved in commercial sex, if we're talking about, there's a statute called promotion of child sexual trafficking that's spelled out, even if a minor is like that, you know, maybe they're saying, because this very often happens, when you'll get picked up by law enforcement or working with a service provider, and they say, he's my boyfriend, he wanted me to help us get some extra money, I was okay with that. I loved him, I wanted to do that for him, because in their head, they really believe that. It doesn't matter if they're a minor, they are still considered a trafficking victim. And then finally, buyers, there's an offense in Indiana specifically just called human trafficking that applies to buyers, and they can be charged with human trafficking whether or not they knew the victim, but the person they were purchasing this is. So really quick, when we talk about means that force, threat, force, or coercion in Indiana, you can see there's a whole list in our statute of, you know, all the different things that could encompass. And the one I always point out is the one they have at the end. Facilitating or controlling a human trafficking victim's access to a controlled substance. Just really quick, I show of hands, how many of you all have worked with or come across somebody who needs housing and also has a substance abuse issue? Yeah, so pretty much most of the folks in the room, right? This is a very common overlap in trafficking cases. It could be somebody who maybe has an addiction and then, you know, somebody exploits that and says, well, I'll provide you, you know, with your next fix as long as you do X, Y, and Z. They use it as a means of control. You know, you're not gonna get your next fix. I know you feel dope sick right now. I'm not giving you your next fit until you come home, you know, to 70 buyers tonight. So, and that's just, self-medication is really common. If you think about, you know, the many strangers that you have to sleep with, the violence, the threats, not having a support network, the physical pain, the health issues they deal with, self-medicating is very, very common. Right, so, what's it really happened here? How many of you all have seen this map before? Okay. Most crowds, I get a few hands go up. So this was put together to response to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They take calls from all 50 states. And then every couple of years, they put this heat map together to show where the calls are most concentrated. So that would be like the, you know, red, the orange. And you can see Indiana up here, right? You can't even really see our state because we're sort of in a blob of red. Any idea as to why that might be? And I'm sorry, no, 500. 500. Okay, so sometimes big events like this happen year round. It can definitely sound as interstates, yeah, what are we called in Indiana? Crossroads in America, right? So you have 65, you've got 70, you know, you've got the highways going up to other major metropolitan areas, Chicago, Cincinnati, Louisville, all those places. Very often human trafficking individuals or human trafficking victims who are being exploited are moved around not only throughout the state itself, but in and out of other states as well. So definitely makes this a hot spot. And then think about, you know, some other things right now, more agriculture. If we're talking about labor trafficking, that's a big, big sector for that. This all, somebody mentioned 8,500, and it doesn't necessarily increase always around big events, but when you have, a lot of like state fairs and carnivals and things coming in and out of the area with seasonal workers, again, labor trafficking, it's very common for those. So the biggest question people always want to know is how much does it really happen here? Data is really hard to quantify because again, victims don't self-identify, right? But on a larger level, we don't have a unified database in Indiana that collects numbers from like law enforcement and service providers to figure out what's really going on. So right now, we rely on the National Human Trafficking Hotline for some of our numbers. And so you can see since it started in 2007 up until 2021, there was over 2,000 victims of human trafficking from Indiana. Does that number surprise anybody? Some yeses, maybe some no's.
Seventh level.
All right, yeah, I'm glad you said that, and we think it's low too, actually. This is likely the tip of the iceberg because there's no mandated reporting to the national hotline. Nobody's required to call it when they see somebody they expect is being trafficked. We encourage people to call, right? Especially if it's not a law enforcement entity, it's really more for connecting survivors with services. And so that's a lot of the calls that if we're talking about minors here in Indiana, because it is considered child abuse, that's mandatory calls, yes, so they have their own separate numbers. They're still trying to figure out how to track that in a really helpful way. And then we've recently just had a law passed last year where law enforcement is required to report investigations to the Attorney General's office. Which on its face sounds great. We're like, yay, there's a way to track data, except law enforcement needs to know that statute exists because they don't all know that. And maybe they have to be trained on human trafficking to know what they're looking for. And they kind of all have in-depth training on that. So that's something that we work on a lot. Right, intersection of homelessness and human trafficking. And again, kind of like the National Human Trafficking Hotline numbers, we have some numbers from some pretty significant large scale studies. And I would say these are on the low side. So 64% of survivors were homeless or in unstable housing when recruited. And then 68% of youth who had either been trafficked or engaged in survival sex had done so while homeless. So if you think of a minor or an adult and they have no housing and, they're out in the elements, they don't have any support network, they're scared, they have no place to stay. It doesn't take a whole lot to pull them into an exploitative situation. It usually starts out as, I have a room at my house or my apartment, you can come stay there, I'm happy to help you out. And after they're there, you need to pay rent now. There's something that you need to do to pay rent to me and make up for that. So I would definitely say that these numbers are higher. These are just the ones that we know about. Okay, getting into those barriers to identification and engagement. So traffickers have a strong psychological pull on them. How many of you have heard of trauma bonding? And seeing hands here and there. It's very similar to Stockholm syndrome. So, it can start out, it very often looks like, a younger female and an older adult male, and the male, figures out that maybe they come from the foster care system, they didn't have a good family background, maybe there's a history of violence or abuse, which is very common. And this is the first person that says, I think you're special. I love you. They compliment them, they give them gifts. There's kind of a grooming process, right? And because this is the first time that person is hearing things like that, it's really exciting. It feels good. My own family's never said they love me. And they start to bond with them. And then there's like a bonding that's mixed with abuse. So they might compliment them at sometimes and beat them. They may give them a gift and then you have to go out and sell yourself tonight to 10 men and 10. Sadly, the reports that I'm seeing, that's on the low side for daily quotas in sex trafficking that victims are often subjected to. But the way their brain chemicals work and that type of manipulation, they really feel like they're in love at that point. They trusted somebody who lied to them. They believe they have a real debt to pay. Again, very common in labor trafficking, it might be somebody who's brought into the country from another country and is told they're going to be. And then they're taken to a completely different state than what, was initially told to them. And, they're forced to work in somebody's home for no pay. And said, we've seen cases where the person is told, as we leave here from whichever country it is, now will be $44,000. Which we know doesn't sound reasonable, right? Because it's somebody who's, from a very poor location in another country, they've never flown before, they don't know anything about the laws here, and they don't have anybody else here that they can turn to. They really feel like they're stuck at that point. So doesn't know their legal rights, they're very often isolated. Embarrassed about what's happening to them, and the trafficker absolutely will tell them, this is your fault. If we're talking about sex trafficking and you have a young person who they're, forced to engage in that, and then the trafficker says, you know what, that was your choice. You chose to do that. You didn't have to, you chose to do it, and they really believe that. A lot of young people, when they're later interviewed, will say, I thought that was my choice, and that's what I deserve. Distrust of law enforcement, this is a really hard one. So frequently, human trafficking victims are forced into engaging in other crimes. Whether it's being forced to sell drugs for their trafficker, theft, battery, a weapons charge, and so they get picked up by law enforcement, right? They get charged for that. They go to juvenile detention. They go through adult court and end up in TOC. So telling them, hey, I'm law enforcement, I'm here to help you. I'm gonna get you out of this situation, right? The likelihood that they're gonna trust that person, especially because the trafficker has told them, listen, if you ever get picked up by police, they're gonna see you as a criminal, not me. You're the one who's going to be arrested, and that's kind of how they work it. That's how they work those situations. And when it ends up like that, the individual thinks, this is exactly what the trafficker told me. And they're not thinking of it as a trafficker. This is, what my daddy or my boyfriend, whoever it is, who said this, what happened to me. Here I am. And so we do a lot of training with law enforcement around being trauma informed and how to interact with these individuals and recognizing they have this on. And then thinking that their situation is better than where they came from. And for us, it's hard to, fathom how could being trafficked by somebody be better than the situation you were in before. But when we talk about vulnerable populations, maybe it's a young person who experienced a lot of abuse in their home, a lot of violence. There could be a whole host of things that happen to them before even being exploited into them. They think, okay, well, at least, what's happening in my home isn't happening anymore. Okay, how many of you all have seen a power and control bill before? All right, what context have you seen it in? Can you think of a related crime? Domestic violence, yeah. All these very similar pieces when we're saying, well, all these terrible things are happening to you, and it was drives us crazy when we see, places that are showing, maybe they're a service agency and they say, well, we help human trafficking victims, and they're posting pictures of somebody with their hands in chains, or children in cages, or tied up, right? Sometimes that may happen, but more often than not, there's these things going on in the background that are keeping them in the situation that they're in. So those threats, the isolation, making sure they don't have any control over their identification or finances. So even if they wanted to leave, they wouldn't feel like they were able to do that. And these are all the things, I call these the trafficker image things that kind of are going on in the background that make identification difficult. But I think there's another category that makes identification hard as well. And that's our own biases and how we're perceiving somebody. When we're talking about adults, so this can be minors as well. Very often we may come across somebody who is in sex work and we think that's a prostitute, right? And because prostitution is illegal, we're basically looking at them as a criminal, right? The reality is, very often they meet the definition of human trafficking victim, and we don't see that. I worked with a survivor who is doing a presentation with me at a court conference coming up in a couple of weeks. And so she was trafficked when she was younger. As an adult, she had a number of prostitution arrests, and she describes one of them and says, officers were doing things and, everyone was treating me as dirty and all these other things. And nobody asked her what was really going on. She was being advertised by him at the time, who was controlling what was going on, and was waiting out in the parking lot, and nobody knew. So, and just to be clear, before I move on, not all prostitution is human trafficking. You may have an adult who, voluntarily engages in sex work, and there's no third party controlling them, right? There's no forced fraud or coercion. But that doesn't mean that they don't have vulnerabilities in their background. Very often there's been, sexual abuse as a child, violence in their background. They may feel like they have no other options. So it's definitely something worth thinking about. All right, drug addicts. So we kind of talk about the overlap with substance use and human trafficking. And so this one particular study really highlights it's a large majority of survivors that have some type of substance use. And so, when we are talking about screening tools and connecting people with resources, this is a huge resource that they need. This last one, I was thinking about this on the way here. We're looking at foreign nationals, especially right now with what all is going on in the border. It's easy to see somebody as an illegal immigrant, right? And that's not to say that human trafficking is not happening at the border, because, but I'm sure it is. I can't say there are a lot of stuff in the news and politicians kind of hype that up, and we don't have concrete numbers on it. But this one study found that very often labor trafficking victims brought in from other countries actually had legal status when they were brought in by the trafficker. They had a work visa, a temporary visa. And it wasn't until they got here, the visa was taken away from them, their identification was taken away, they had no means of following up and reporting. And then the trafficker said, well, you're now legal. If you tell anybody what's going on, you're going to be arrested and thrown in jail for a really long time in this country. You will never see your family again. So, all of that to say, when you're coming across individuals who may have a variety of things going on in their background, thinking about, beyond just what you see on the surface and what really got them there in the first place. With working with time here, all perfect content. I'm gonna hand it off to Marissa.
So, really likes the opening presentation of the guy who's dancing, shaking it out. So as we're switching up here, feel free to shake it out. The survivor-centered response is really important to me, for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, I'm trained as a mental health counselor. So anytime I'm working with humans, my automatic first thought is, how is their mental health? How is their physical health and their well-being? And for survivors, that it should always be client-led, right? Sometimes we can't meet clients' needs immediately, and that's frustrating for everyone, but to really let them make decisions about their lives as much as possible, listening to what they need. So in the training that I do with rape crisis centers, I always emphasize, ask the person what justice and healing would mean. Ask them, because they may have a very different view. For many of us, we would think, oh, well, the person who committed a crime against me, I want them to go to jail forever, right? Like that's sort of the assumption, if you haven't experienced crime. And a lot of times it's really just about getting their life back. And whatever that means, and so helping them get to those community resources. Cultural sensitivity and humility is everything, right? So culture goes beyond our race, our gender, and it really is just a number of things. You know, when I moved from Southern Ohio to Northern Indiana to go to college, that was a culture shock. Even though it was a small campus, I was like, what is going on here? You know, there's accents I don't understand, and it's just want to stay over. So, understanding that going through this particular set of traumas is also re-emerging from a specific culture, and being sensitive to that. Trauma-informed services, I'm a little sad that, I'm missing the trauma-informed shelter presentation, which is one of the other presenters right now, because that's really what we need. When I entered the anti-trafficking advocacy world, I was in undergrad, and I went in, there was a place in Dayton, Ohio called Oasis House, and they were raising funds for trauma-informed housing. You know, every survivor would get their own room, they could furnish it how they wanted, you know, basically just buying old buildings and flipping them. And, you know, I think that's a great idea, and we're seeing more of that. And so being able to connect with funders and grantors and think about what can we do that's beyond shelter? What can we, or if it is a shelter, how can we just redesign it? So that's really great. But before we do those big picture things, we also need to think about step one, you know, what are the safety risks of this person, right? You're trying to house them and, you know, they change their phone number all the time. That's quite common in, trafficking, right? And understanding that their version of safety might not be your version of safety, and they probably are stressing you out. But understanding that if you provide, again, we step into the gap and are able to provide those immediate needs and ongoing needs, resource connection, that's coming from a safe place and not a coercive place, we're doing, those survivors a great service. And then listening and learning, from survivors, so, some of you may or may not know, but it's pretty common in the sexual violence and domestic violence world for people to go through their own experiences of sexual violence and domestic violence, and after, you know, doing their inner work, they want to give back, they start nonprofits. And survivor-led organizations are everything. You know, you think about peer recovery for substance use or housing, peer recovery. So people who have actually been homeless before, those are the people that survivors trust the most because they know, okay, you get it. You may not know my exact experience, but it's close enough, right? That I know that you see me. And so survivor-led organizations, we are always looking to lift them up. So our immediate needs for trafficking survivors specifically, I did a lot of interviewing survivors and survivor leaders when putting together this presentation. So this is coming from survivors through me to you. There is a quote from one of a really good like emerging article that came out in 2006. And I really think this just says it all. First, of course, I need to have someone to talk to. I need to have someone to trust. In my situation, I do not know who to trust. Whenever I say what is deep, what I feel, I keep to myself because I don't want it to turn around and hurt me later. Not sure what kind of influence the person has. So, you know, as I have been on the ICBA assessment task force and working to, we've got new templates ready to replace that guys spit out, and we're working on that. And that's been really, it's been an honor to speak into that, because I know there's very mixed feelings and about the assessment and wanting to make it better. So when we're doing that, we need to think about, okay, survivors already have so many walls up. So we're asking questions that are really intrusive. Maybe thinking about do I need to ask this question in order for them to be eligible for services? Sometimes you do, right? Sometimes you will need to know about substance use history and income, those things make sense to ask. But how we ask it is really the biggest thing in building rapport. And these always emerge as our highest needs. Instead of housing on the slide, we're already talking about housing, so I know you all know that. But transportation and housing, I'm sure y'all know that is the biggest barrier. You can give someone a bus pass, but maybe where they're staying, on the street or the front is a ways away from that bus pass, and maybe someone doesn't have a car. All of these things are very common among trafficking survivors. So finding creative ways of transportation. There's, I don't remember what county it's in, but I was providing some technical assistance to a rape crisis center, I think in the southern part of the state. And they just have a nonprofit down there that picks people up for $1 a day. And just drives them around. That's so great. I wish we had that everywhere. So, understanding that we can be creative, but always wanting to provide a space for the survivor to take the lead in themselves. And then these ongoing needs, if you work in a housing specific arena, you're not gonna be the one that's facilitating this normally. I know my husband is actually a housing case manager, in youth group, so we talk about this a lot. But he's really passionate and he'll kind of go and do these things, but, you don't need to take that on if you are focused on housing, that's great. But just being aware that these ongoing needs are going to prevent homelessness in the future, not indefinitely, of course, but they are protective factors. We think about risk factors, meeting these needs would be the opposite of a risk factor. So for mental health care, there's some specific trauma-informed providers and approaches. I've listed some of them here, and of course, you'll be able to go and reference it on the slide. Some people aren't ready to dig into trauma, and that's fine. So traditional talk therapy, basic grounding skills, that's gonna be best for them, right? But sometimes we do need to kind of go to the root of the problem, right? And so just helping maybe connect with your local mental health providers and say is anyone certified in this? What do you provide for trauma survivors? Legal needs, evictions, criminal records, you want to know that's huge. In trafficking, if someone has prostitution charges or they have criminal charges that took place within their trafficking experience, those can be vacated, and they can apply for to have those scrubbed from their record, or cleared. And so having a legal provider, Indiana Legal Services, they've got their here, scout here, not Indiana Legal Services, sorry, but, free legal help out here, that is huge. Just understanding their rights. For ethical medical care, with the infectious disease team, I was so glad to see them here because, sexually transmitted infections, unhealed fractures, that happens, if you are living in a high-risk situation. And being able to have providers that of that can have that compassionate hand, or maybe come into a shelter, come into an RRH program, and assist you with maybe free screenings or cost screenings, just creative ways to help folks out. And understanding that if you're working to house a human trafficking survivor, if they've exited especially a long-term trafficking situation, so started in childhood and kept going, or even just as an adult, re-entry is similar to combat veterans, the levels of PTSD, the levels of behavioral and mental health concerns. So, I think probably all of us know someone who served in the armed forces, Marines, Navy, Air Force, and sometimes when those folks come back, it's a while, and some folks don't fully come back, and that's, it's hard, so hard to see, but understanding that there are a lot of things to unlearn and relearn, and exercising patience in that process. So we're talking about collaborative care, how do we do it? How do we refer people to more appropriate, services if our services aren't the most appropriate? Again, safety and immediate needs, being able to ask them, do they have a person that they trust to keep them safe? Not just do you have a person you trust, because we all know you've trusted people in the past who have broken that trust. It can be simple and straightforward, or it can be pretty catastrophic. And so there's some safety planning guidelines here from the Human Trafficking Hotline, different ways to ask questions. As a licensed therapist, I can tell you, you can ask someone the same question as a yes or no, or as a tell me more about, and you will get two completely different answers. So just some basic guidance on how to ask those questions. Connecting with your victim advocates. So our sexual assault program directors, they've done a fantastic job. Our director is Kelly Garland, and our program coordinator is Alexis Moore. She just recently started with us. In the past year, we've been able to certify at least 3 or 4 rape crisis centers. So take them from, a service provider to a fully official rape crisis center, which is so exciting. And not every region has one, so hopefully that will change in the future. But most regions have one, and a lot of them haven't had training in human trafficking recently. And so being able to connect with them, those 24/7 hotlines, being able to do more and almost if you're the first point of contact and then something more happens and you want to connect them with victim advocacy, just sitting down and having these conversations in the community, that's great. Another law that I like the laws that just really help the people, right? It's not a, don't do this, it's, hey, this is how we can serve you. I love that. So in a situation of trafficking, whether it be sex trafficking or labor trafficking, law enforcement is mandated to provide protection to that victim if their safety is at risk. So if they have been completely removed from the situation, the trafficker, maybe the trafficker already went to jail, and they are in a safe space, perhaps not, but as we know with domestic violence, stalking, etc., it's pretty common for the folks who cause that violence to keep tabs on their victims, right? Through stalking, through online harassment, etc. So that's something that law enforcement is required to do. So if you are in a case that starts to unfold, you're working with a client and things like this are happening, you can reach out to law enforcement and they can provide that protection. Indiana 211, those community resources, findhelp.org, it's a great place to start. It's a very large directory, but you can sit down with clients and go through that. Maybe they're just looking for a local food bank, and it's just a quick, easy resource to look at that. Trauma informed providers, the top one is not a specific human trafficking service, but Recovery Works is a program. How many of you know about Recovery Works? Yeah, great. I love it. When I was a therapist at Families First, I had a lot of referrals from Recovery Works. So it's a Medicaid funded program. If somebody has a felony charge, and in some cases misdemeanor charges, and they need substance use or mental health treatment, Recovery Works will cover it. Usually up to 100%. And so knowing about these things, being able to connect with those folks is huge. And as you saw, a lot of overlap with substance use and trafficking. So maybe we can't address the sexual violence right now with therapy, but maybe we can get them into treatment, right? And then IDVAP, that stands for Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. And we had some youth homelessness workers back there. Yeah, so this is really great for folks who maybe the kiddos are DCS involved, have a history system involvement. There are so many different services that can provide. It can be case management, counseling, etc. And it helps at-risk youth as well, so they don't have to have been a substantiated victim, right? They can have those risk factors. And they will reimburse the providers up to 100% in most cases. It does only go up to age 24 though. So that's why we're always on about looking for more funding for adults, because we know it is needed. But that is a great service. And then considering the needs of marginalized populations. So we talked about, cultural humility a little bit back, understanding that I cannot fully, do the work of being able to understand someone's experience, right? But I can do my best and I can educate myself. And so, understanding that someone with a disability is gonna have a very different need when it comes to housing, and wraparound services. Folks who identify as LGBTQ, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, knowing that, those ACEs, right, the things that we go through, they affect us all a little bit differently, and making space for that. This is a quick checklist that you can refer to later, that I developed to really help folks. If you feel like you are seeing a lot of, red flags, which I put in here, I'm sure where they are, I'm going to fix them. This will help you develop a more HD competent service. So understanding, do we have written procedures? Do we know what to do? We have new hires, do they know what to do? And if your agency is interested in really committing to, having some trafficking specific program, we are just, doing, evidence-based practice with them, let me know, I'd be happy to help. Okay, so I'm gonna go to red flags before we talk about donors, or community partners. Red flag examples. So as Karen was discussing, red flags are not one size fits all. You can have one person who, seems so obvious that something is wrong, and then, the next person, maybe they want the same thing, but you don't know. So these are examples, not one size fits all. And this is kind of small, but things that really stick out to me are, when folks come into crisis centers, like asking for permission to eat or sleep or use the toilet. Like if you do a community meal setting, they're just kind of sitting there, eating, sort of waiting for permission. They don't know where their identity documents are. A lot of people have tattoos now, so, what I find is if people don't want to tell you the story about their tattoo, that's interesting, because I will tell the story about mine all day, right? So if they feel comfortable with it, maybe that says that something, there's a bad memory there. And then lack of knowledge about where they are, this one can overlap with mental health, like dissociation, substance use, so it's not specific to trafficking. But that is something that we want to take note of. The more suspicious things you're seeing that kind of overlap, that can give you pause, and then that's something to think about. So I'm gonna give you some, explicit resources before we go, and we're coming to the end of our time here. Reporting, pretty straightforward, immediate danger, we want to call 911. We feel like that person needs a welfare check, or if they, are, in danger of dying, right? That is, important, we want to get them the help they need. As we mentioned, human trafficking is considered child abuse in the state, so when you call the DCS hotline, you want to say, I suspect human trafficking, because that will route the call to the human trafficking trained, DCS staff. So that is very important. And of course, just like any call, if you are wrong, okay, that's fine. But still want to make sure if we suspect it's that, let's get it routed to the right place. And then for adult protective services, I know this one can be tricky because, it can be weaponized, right? Like folks kind of have that stigma and stereotype about people experiencing homelessness, that they automatically can't take care of themselves, right? Which we know is not true. But if you have a situation where someone is fully incapacitated, environmental illness, drug use, other impairments, just not, not online, not able to care for themselves, things have gotten really bad. And you're genuinely concerned that they are being exploited and incapacitated by that, that's when we make a call to APS. And so there's some nuances there, but really what you want to look at is, can they manage their property and provide self-care to themselves? In the cases of severe exploitation, they're not in charge of that, right? So of course, if you're questions, you talk to your supervisor, you talk to the peers, you reference the resources there. This is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I highly recommend, bookmarking it, putting it in your phone, et cetera, just so it's on hand. And then we have many local and statewide resources, so this list is not exhaustive, thankfully. We have more providers, but we are at HT, so we do a lot of training, education, helping to coordinate service providers together. So if you have a resource need and you're like, I don't think this is in my community, please ask us. If that serves you up to 24. IPATH is the state task force that we talked about, so, the housing subcommittee that I spoke about, I'm currently the chairperson of that. And as I said, part of that is sitting on the IHCA assessment task force and speaking into how do we do trauma-informed questioning, how do we consider the needs of domestic violence and human trafficking survivors. For legal services, Indiana Legal Services has offices around the state. So they are located here in Franklin County, but they have specific, it's called the Workers' Rights and Protection Project, and they have labor trafficking attorneys and attorneys who specialize in sex trafficking cases. So they're a great resource. And the Freedom Network Housing Project, there are so many trainings, free trainings and webinars on there. Regarding the overlap of HT and housing, the overlap of substance use and housing, and really just supporting this population. So I recommend that. These are our contact information. It's just our first name at HT. Thank you so much for participating. I'll be up front and Karen will be as well. If you have questions, I'm sorry, I didn't leave much time for questions. If anyone has, there's someone back there, yeah. Yes. National hotline. Similar to most hotlines, if you see something and you're unsure, you can always call. There are a lot of survivors who find whenever you call in, and that's great. But if you're working with someone and you suspect, and you want to give them resources, you can certainly call with them on local resources. You can ask us, or you can ask it back. But the national hotline knows about national resources, and sometimes that's important. We're looking to be okay. So, anything else? Is there a question? I'll be up here if you want to talk, and as well, Karen. Thank you.